The very word conjures images of snarling, battle-hardened creatures, their forms twisted by malice, their lives bound in servitude to the Dark Lords. They are the embodiment of corruption, bred for war, instruments of destruction, wielded by Morgoth and Sauron in their long wars against elves and men. But beyond their cruel design, their tireless marches, and their savage cries upon the battlefield, a deeper question lingers in the minds of those who seek to understand the nature of Middle-earth's most reviled beings. Did orcs have families? Could these creatures, seemingly bereft of compassion, know the bonds of kinship, of parent to child, of brother to brother? To answer this, one must first look back to the origins of the orcs. The lore of their creation is veiled in uncertainty, and Tolkien himself left various accounts, sometimes conflicting, of their beginnings. In the Silmarillion, it is said that Morgoth, unable to create life of his own, took elves who had wandered into his grasp in the earliest years of the world, twisting and breaking them through long torment until they became the first orcs, which all that race were bred by him in envy and mockery of the elves, it is written. A corruption so deep that no grace of the Valar could heal it. This origin alone suggests a cruel fate. Beings torn from their own nature, turned into thralls of Morgoth's will, with hatred and pain as their only inheritance. Yet, if orcs were once elves, did they retain any semblance of their former nature? Did they procreate as the elves did? There is evidence to suggest that they did, at least in a base and degraded manner. In Morgoth's Ring, one of the later volumes of the history of Middle-earth, Tolkien revisited the issue, considering that Morgoth might have bred orcs through a more traditional biological means. He speculated that they multiplied after the manner of the children of Ilúvatar, meaning they must have had male and female counterparts, and that offspring were born, not merely spawned from sorcery. This notion is reinforced by various accounts in The Lord of the Rings. In the Dark Towers of Mordor and Isengard, orcs formed entire societies, where orders were given, supplies were managed, and ranks were organized. The existence of Uruk-hai, stronger and more resilient than lesser orcs, implies a form of selective breeding or interbreeding with other beings, likely men, under Sauron and Saruman's command. If orcs were bred, there must have been a way for them to sustain their numbers across centuries, particularly when their losses in battle were so great. But did they form families as elves and men understood them? This is where the darkness thickens. In no tale does an orc show tenderness to its kin, nor is there any mention of an orc mother singing to her child, of a father teaching a son to wield a blade. Their societies, as glimpsed through the accounts of Gorbag and Shagrat in The Return of the King, were driven by suspicion and violence, where kinship, if it existed, was secondary to survival and hierarchy. Orcs might have known of their parentage, but love, as the Free Peoples understood it, was foreign to them. It is likely that in the dark pits of Angband, Mordor, and Isengard, orcs were raised not by nurturing hands, but by cruelty and subjugation. They would have been trained from an early age to fight, to obey, to hate. Their family, if such a term could be used, would have been their warband, their loyalty dictated by fear rather than blood. Yet there are whispers of something deeper, something unsettling. The very existence of female orcs is rarely mentioned, but there are hints. In the Book of Lost Tales, one of Tolkien's earliest accounts of Middle-earth, there is a suggestion that Morgoth might have needed orc women to breed his armies. Later texts lean toward the idea that orcs could reproduce naturally, meaning that somewhere in the depths of Mordor or Gundabad, there may have been entire generations of orcs, young and old, living out their bleak existence under the lash of their masters. And if orcs had children, what became of them? Did they ever laugh? Did they ever wonder about the world beyond their strongholds? It is a cruel thing to imagine. A young orc born into darkness, knowing nothing but the grind of war, never given the choice to be anything else. It is a question that Tolkien himself wrestled with. For if orcs were truly irredeemable, if they were wholly evil without capacity for choice, then the morality of the Free People's war against them becomes troubling. To kill an enemy in battle is one thing. To wipe out a race incapable of redemption is another. This may be why Tolkien in his later years struggled with the nature of orcs. In one letter, he suggested that orcs were not beyond saving, that a good orc might exist, even if it was rare. But how would such a creature come to be? Could an orc, raised outside of Morgoth's or Sauron's influence, become something else? If orcs had families, could a mother or father love their child enough to wish them a different fate? These are questions that Tolkien never fully resolved, but they linger in the shadows of his legendarium. Perhaps the final answer lies not in whether orcs had families, but whether they were ever allowed to be anything other than what they were made for. In every account, their lives are bound to darkness, their nature shaped by the will of their masters. Whether they had kin, whether they bore children in secret places far from the eyes of their overlords, may never be known. What is certain is that, in the world of Middle-earth, they were never truly free. And so we are left with a question that has no easy answer. Did orcs have families? If we mean in the sense of bonds forged in love, of homes built on trust and care, then no. Nothing in Tolkien's works suggests that such a thing existed among them. But if we mean in the bleak, functional sense of reproduction, of lineage without love, then yes, it is likely they did. Yet in the end, orcs were never granted a future beyond war. Their lineages, if they existed, were not tales of joy or hope, but of despair, an unbroken chain of suffering from one generation to the next. And therein lies the true tragedy of the orcs. Not merely that they were enslaved, but that they were never given the chance to be anything else. If orcs indeed had families, their existence was unlike anything found among elves, men, or even dwarves. There were no hearths where fathers told stories to their children, no traditions passed lovingly through generations. Instead, any sense of kinship among them would have been shaped by the unrelenting cruelty of their masters. Morgoth and Sauron, in their dark designs, would have permitted nothing that softened the orcs' nature. Fear and discipline would have been the pillars upon which their society was built, leaving no room for sentiment. Yet the very existence of an orcish hierarchy implies some level of organization beyond simple bloodlust. In The Lord of the Rings, we see that orcs are not mindless beasts. They strategize, form alliances, and even rebel against one another. Shagrat and Gorbag, as captains of their respective groups, speak of getting away from their service, of escaping to find some measure of peace, away from the Great War. This suggests that, while their lives were steeped in violence, some among them were aware of alternatives, even if those alternatives were mere fantasies. One of the most telling indications that orcs had a system of reproduction, and by extension some notion of familial bonds, is the existence of different breeds. We see throughout Tolkien's works that not all orcs are the same. The smaller, more goblin-like orcs of Moria were different from the Uruk-hai of Isengard, who in turn were distinct from the Mordor orcs under Sauron's direct command. The very concept of breeding suggests selection, implying that some form of orcish reproduction was necessary to sustain their numbers. But did they raise their young? The absence of any direct mention of orcish nurseries or childhoods in Tolkien's writings suggests that young orcs were likely raised communally, or more accurately, systematically. Given their nature, it is likely that once they reached a certain age, they were taken from their birth-givers and placed into the brutal life of an orc warrior. The notion of an orcish mother, fiercely protective of her offspring, is difficult to reconcile with everything we know about their culture. More likely, young orcs were raised in barracks or pits, trained through pain and hardship to become what their masters required. If this was the case, then the concept of family among the orcs would have been twisted beyond recognition. A child might never know their parents. Instead, their loyalty would be to their immediate warband, their kin, defined by their role in combat rather than by blood. Older orcs, rather than mentors or protectors, would have been overseers, ensuring that the new generation was as hardened and ruthless as the last. This approach to reproduction and upbringing would explain why orcs remained so utterly dedicated to their masters. Without the emotional ties that typically bind families together, there would be no sense of self beyond servitude. An orc did not fight for the survival of their kin. They fought because they knew nothing else. However, there are hints, faint and scattered, of something more complex. In the history of Middle-earth, there are occasional references to orcs showing frustration, envy, even dark humor. If they were wholly devoid of any form of personal attachment, such emotions might not exist at all. Gorbag's brief moment of longing for a life outside of Mordor is one of the rare glimpses of something beyond mindless obedience. Could it be that, in some hidden corners of their existence, away from the eyes of their masters, some orcs did form rudimentary bonds? If so, these would have been fragile, built in the shadows of a world that allowed them no freedom. It is here that one of the most unsettling implications arises. If orcs had families, did they mourn? Did they feel loss when a comrade fell in battle? Or was it merely another casualty in an endless war? We see no orc funerals, no remembrance of the fallen. Their lives were spent in slaughter, and their deaths were met with indifference. But perhaps, in the darkest recesses of their minds, there was something more. Some flicker of regret buried beneath centuries of hate. Tolkien's own struggles with the nature of orcs make it clear that he was uneasy with the idea of an irredeemable race. He toyed with different explanations for their origins, at times suggesting that orcs were creatures of pure malice, at others leaving room for the possibility that they were redeemable, however unlikely that redemption might be. This uncertainty adds to the tragedy of their existence. Imagine, if you will, an orc who begins to question. One who, through some strange quirk of fate, wonders if there is more to life than war. Would they be hunted by their own kind? Would they be slaughtered as a traitor? Or would their fellow orcs in some silent, unspoken way understand? And if they had a child, would they dare to hope that this one might escape the cycle of violence? Perhaps that is the true horror of the orcs' existence. Not just that they were born to serve, but that even if they longed for something different, they had no means to grasp it. Every aspect of their being, from birth to death, was dictated by forces beyond their control. And what of those forces? Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, shaped the orcs through malice and mockery. Sauron refined them, using them as his most numerous and expendable troops. Saruman, in his ambition, bred a new kind of orc, the Uruk-hai, blending them with men to create warriors of even greater strength. Each of these Dark Lords saw the orcs as nothing more than tools, their existence a mere necessity for war. The fact that these beings were bred, shaped, and controlled for such a singular purpose raises profound moral questions. If an orc had no choice but to be what they were, was it truly their fault? When Legolas and Gimli slay hordes of orcs without hesitation, are they striking down irredeemable monsters? Or are they destroying beings who never had the chance to be anything else? It is a question Tolkien never answered directly, perhaps because to do so would unravel the moral simplicity of war. In the end, the question of whether orcs had families is not merely about whether they reproduced, but whether they were ever allowed to be more than what they were made to be. If they did have families, those bonds were twisted by the same darkness that shaped their entire race. Love, if it existed among them, was unrecognizable. Their kinship was forged not in affection, but in brutality. Their survival depended not on unity, but on dominance. And yet, deep in the forgotten histories of Middle-earth, in the shadows beyond what was written, there may have been exceptions. An orc who questioned, a child who longed for something more, a fleeting moment of recognition between two beings who, despite all that was done to them, still felt something like kinship. But such stories were never told. The wars of Middle-earth ended, the Dark Lords fell, and the orcs faded into myth. Their fate, like so much of their existence, remains an enigma, a riddle lost to time, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. And so the tale of the orcs, and whether they had families, remains a tragic one. It is a story of a people without choice, without history beyond war, without a future beyond ruin. If there were ever children of the orcs who dreamed of something different, history does not remember them. The pages of Middle-earth's chronicles are filled with the deeds of kings and heroes, with the songs of elves and the oaths of men. Nowhere does an orc's lament endure. Yet one must wonder, If Middle-earth had known peace for 1,000 years, if the Orcs had been freed from the will of their masters, could they have become something else? If a child of Mordor had been given the chance to grow in a world without war, without the lash, without the certainty of bloodshed, might they not have found another path? Or was their fate written in the very fabric of their being, from the first moment Morgoth twisted their ancestors into his slaves? Tolkien himself wrestled with these questions. In his letters, he admitted to discomfort at the idea that any race could be wholly, irredeemably evil. Yet his works give us no account of an orc laying down their sword, of an orc choosing mercy over cruelty. Their existence was one of ceaseless war, and when the final battle was fought, they were left to fade into the shadows of legend. Perhaps that is the final unspoken tragedy of the Orcs. Not that they were bred for war, not that they lived in darkness, but that no songs were ever sung for them. No history was ever written for their kind, no memory kept beyond the tales of their savagery. Whatever they were beyond soldiers of the Dark Lords, whether they had mothers, fathers, children, was lost, forgotten, made unimportant by the tides of history. And so we are left with only speculation, fragments of evidence scattered across Tolkien's writings. Did orcs have families? Yes, in the biological sense, they likely did. But in the sense of love, of legacy, of shared memory, they had none. And perhaps that is the greatest curse of all.